A bustling terminal at Los Angeles International Airport. The usual flurry of suitcases, rolling announcements echoing, and passengers rushing to their gates. Amid the crowd, a boy no more than 13 stands out in an immaculately tailored suit. He seems confident, yet there's a hint of apprehension in his eyes. Nearby, a flight attendant glances at him with disapproval, whispering snide remarks under her breath. Little does she know the secret behind this young passenger's polished appearance. And little does she know that her casual cruelty is about to set off a chain of events that will rock her entire world. The sun was beginning its slow descent over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of vibrant orange and pale pink. Inside the sprawling terminals of LAX, throngs of weary travelers moved in a choreographed dance to the soundtrack of rolling suitcases, beeping announcements, and overhead chatter. It was a typical late afternoon in the airport, families returning from vacations, business executives jetting off to conferences, and flight crews hurrying to their designated gates. In Terminal 2, near Gate 23, a seemingly ordinary scene was about to become extraordinary. A sharply dressed boy, tall for his age, his dark skin offset by an impeccably cut charcoal grey suit, stood near a window overlooking the tarmac. He fiddled with a smartphone that appeared almost too large for his slender hands. At first glance, no one would suspect anything unusual, except it was highly unorthodox to see a teenager clad in a suit that looked straight out of a GQ magazine. People cast curious glances. Some assumed he was a child actor or some sort of prodigy. Others found it endearing, but paid little mind. But there was one person who took a particular interest in this boy. Sabrina Hayes was a flight attendant for Delta Airlines, a real airline that boasted a reputation for good service and a wide global network. Sabrina had been with the company for 6 years, and she prided herself on being able to read passengers at a glance. She noticed the boy as soon as she arrived at Gate 23 for her pre-flight briefing. Something about that perfectly fitted suit and the boy's calm demeanor rubbed her the wrong way, though she couldn't place exactly why. Perhaps it was because he looked too composed for a typical kid. Maybe it was a sense of intimidation. He dressed better than many adults Sabrina had seen. Or maybe it was the color of his skin, and the quiet, uncomfortable prejudices lurking in her mind began to surface in the form of sharp judgments. Sabrina was one of 3 flight attendants assigned to Flight 627, a popular late-afternoon route from Los Angeles to New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. The flight was scheduled to depart in an hour, so she had plenty of time to observe passengers milling around before boarding. As she watched the boy, let's call him Malcolm West. Sabrina's eyes narrowed. She muttered something under her breath. A co-worker. Daniel heard her, but chose not to comment, deciding it was wiser to ignore Sabrina's occasional lapses in professionalism. Look at him, Sabrina whispered to Daniel. Who dresses like that? He's probably just showing off. No parents in sight either. This is going to be trouble. Daniel frowned. He's just a kid, Sabrina. Don't jump to conclusions. But Sabrina merely smirked. She had decided something about Malcolm that would taint her treatment of him from this moment on. Daniel looked between them uneasy, but had no clue how significant Sabrina's prejudice would prove in the hours to come. Seated by the window, Malcolm took a moment to reflect. The hustle of people around him faded as he focused on the planes outside, lined up like giant birds awaiting flight. He was in Los Angeles for a youth leadership summit he had attended the previous week. His mother, Lauren West, was a high-powered attorney in New York, unable to accompany him this time due to a massive case. His father, Charles West, was the newly appointed CEO of the very airline he was about to fly with. Yes, the airline was none other than Delta Airlines, known globally, but now under Charles West's forward-thinking vision. Charles had been pushing for diversity, equity, and modernization within the company. Unfortunately, Malcolm's dad couldn't travel to pick him up because of a critical board meeting. Instead, the plan was for Malcolm to fly unaccompanied back to New York, where he'd be greeted by a driver at JFK. Then he'd go straight home to the family's upscale Manhattan apartment. Malcolm wasn't completely alone in LAX, though. A family friend, Patricia, had accompanied him to the airport to ensure he got through security and all the administrative checks for an unaccompanied minor. But Patricia had another flight to catch and left about 20 minutes earlier. It wasn't the first time Malcolm traveled in such formal attire. He learned from his father that dressing well commands respect, especially in professional or adult environments. It's not about showing off. Charles had told him, it's about showing yourself that you deserve to be here no matter who you are. Being a young black kid in predominantly white-dominated spaces, Malcolm understood the importance of that lesson all too well. Nevertheless, despite his father's proud and progressive stance, Malcolm always felt a twinge of anxiety traveling alone. Sometimes flight attendants or TSA officers gave him strange looks. Sometimes he dealt with outright condescension. He'd learned to handle it politely, as his father taught him. Still, it stung every time someone silently questioned whether he belonged. This trip he hoped would be uneventful. Little did he know, an encounter with flight attendant Sabrina Hayes was about to turn everything upside down. About 45 minutes before takeoff boarding was announced. First-class passengers and those needing extra assistance were allowed to board first. Malcolm held a first-class ticket, partly because of his father's high position with the airline, partly because it was a perk that frequently allowed him to travel in comfort. He gathered his carry-on suitcase and approached the gate. A gate agent scanned his boarding pass, gave him a bright smile, and waved him through without any issues. Standing just inside the plane's entrance greeting passengers was Sabrina, along with Daniel behind her. As Malcolm stepped on board, Sabrina's eyes flicked from the top of his well-groomed hair to the tips of his polished shoes. She forced a smile, but it did not reach her eyes. "First class is to your left," she said curtly. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" Her tone stopped Malcolm in his tracks. There was no warmth or courtesy in her voice, just a frosty, borderline, accusatory question. He tried to remain polite as he handed her his boarding pass. "Yes, ma'am. This is my seat assignment." Sabrina flicked her gaze over the boarding pass. She seemed to double-check it, searching for an error. When she couldn't find anything amiss, she pursed her lips. "Right this way," she said, leading Malcolm into the first-class compartment. Daniel, who was helping the economy passengers farther down, noticed the exchange. He winced. Something told him Sabrina was going to be trouble tonight. Malcolm took his seat 2A by the window. He placed his carry-on in the overhead bin. Settling into the plush seat, he exhaled softly, trying to shake off the tense moment. Usually flight attendants were friendly, or at least neutrally polite. Sabrina's tone had been neither. A small knot of anxiety formed in his chest, but he tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the fact that he'd be home soon. That was all that mattered. The first-class cabin was spacious, with only 8 seats arranged 2 per row. Across the aisle sat a middle-aged couple, Charles and Mary Evans, dressed casually in jeans and sneakers, flipping through in-flight magazines. They offered Malcolm a friendly nod, which he returned. Directly behind him sat an older gentleman wearing a crisp business suit, tapping furiously on his laptop. 2 seats behind that man was an elegant woman in her late 30s, rummaging through a stylish handbag. As boarding continued, Malcolm felt relief that everyone else seemed either indifferent or pleasant. No one appeared to be giving him the kind of scrutiny Sabrina had. He pulled out his phone to text his father a quick note. "Boarded safely, seat is great. Love you. See you soon." After hitting send, he switched his phone to airplane mode and waited for takeoff. The cabin door closed and the standard safety announcements played overhead. Sabrina started her demonstration, aided by Daniel, who still looked somewhat wary. The plane pushed back from the gate, taxied for a few minutes, and soon the engines roared to life. Malcolm felt the familiar rush as Flight 627 lifted into the air, leaving the City of Angels behind for the bright lights of New York City. Once the seatbelt sign was off and the plane reached cruising altitude, Sabrina and Daniel began the first-class service. Normally, the flight attendants would offer drinks, a meal choice, and ensure the passengers were comfortable. Sabrina started with the middle-aged couple and then moved to the older gentleman behind Malcolm. She took their drink orders with professional courtesy, albeit in a slightly rushed manner. Then she approached Malcolm. "Would you like anything to drink?" she asked, her voice flat. "May I have a ginger ale, please?" Malcolm replied quietly. He always ordered ginger ale. Something about the fizz and the mild flavor settled his nerves. Sabrina nodded, but rolled her eyes. "Sure." Malcolm noticed the eye roll. It was subtle, but definitely there. He decided not to say anything. Maybe she was just having a bad day, he thought, and there was no need to escalate. A moment later, Sabrina returned with his ginger ale, but didn't offer the typical courtesy of a napkin or a straw. She simply plunked the cup down on the tray table and walked away without another word. Malcolm's cheeks heated with discomfort. The couple across the aisle watched the interaction, exchanging concerned glances. They too sensed an unusual tension. Mary Evans turned to her husband. "That was strange," she whispered. Her husband just shrugged and shook his head, unsure of what to make of it. Over the next hour, Sabrina's attitude grew more blatant. She served everyone else their meals with a smile, but when it came time to serve Malcolm, her tone was dismissive. She forgot to ask him about his meal preference until last, and when she finally did, the only option left was the vegetarian dish, which was fine by Malcolm. But it was how she presented it, unceremoniously, dropping the tray in front of him, that made him feel singled out. The older gentleman in row 3, named Mr. Garrison, had noticed the pattern. He leaned forward at one point and said, "Young man, are you all right?" "She seems to be giving you a hard time." Malcolm smiled politely. "I'm fine, sir." "Thanks for asking." Though he tried to remain composed, the tension coiled tighter in his chest. Should he speak up? Should he let it go? His parents had always taught him to stand up for himself, but also to pick battles wisely. For now, he continued to take the high road, hoping things might calm down on their own. About 2 hours into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed for passengers who wanted to rest. Daniel came by with a tray of water bottles and some small amenities like eye masks and socks. When he reached Malcolm, he offered a gentle smile. "Here you go," Daniel said, handing Malcolm the small bottle and an eye mask. "Please let me know if you need anything." "Okay." "Thank you," Malcolm replied, grateful for the kindness. Sabrina was still at the front of the cabin, arranging some items. Suddenly, turbulence rocked the plane, and Malcolm's water bottle slipped from his grip, falling to the floor and rolling toward the aisle. He quickly unbuckled his belt to retrieve it, but hesitated because the seatbelt sign blinked on. By the time he stood, Sabrina was already there, picking it up. "Be careful," she hissed under her breath. "You're not supposed to move around when the seatbelt sign is on." "I'm sorry," Malcolm stammered. "It just slipped. I don't want any trouble on my flight," she interrupted. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, ma'am. It was an accident." Sabrina exhaled sharply. Her voice dropped to a near whisper laced with contempt. "Listen, kid, I don't know who you think you are dressed up like that, acting like you own the place. But just because you're wearing a fancy suit doesn't mean you get special treatment. Obey the rules, or we'll have a problem." Shocked, Malcolm froze. The couple in the seat across the aisle overheard the exchange, their eyes widening. Daniel, coming up the aisle, also caught the tail end of Sabrina's words. He opened his mouth to speak, but seemed at a loss. I apologize," Malcolm said, trying to remain calm. Sabrina shoved the bottle into his hands. "Sit down." Malcolm sat, his mind whirling. He felt a sting of humiliation and confusion. Why would she talk to him like that? He'd done nothing wrong. All he could think was that she must have some prejudice against him, either because of his age, his race, or both. His heart pounded in his chest as he buckled his seatbelt again, blinking back the hot prickle of tears. He would not cry on this plane in front of this woman. Malcolm's mind drifted to a memory, sitting in his father's home office, surrounded by large windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Charles West, CEO of Delta Airlines, was telling his son about traveling solo. "Malcolm, you might face people who doubt you or treat you differently because you're young, or because you're black, or both. But never let anyone make you feel small. Remember, confidence is power. And if push comes to shove, don't hesitate to let them know who you are and who you represent. Not in a boastful way, but in a way that reminds them you have every right to be there." Malcolm had nodded back, then understanding, but also hoping it would never come to that. Yet here he was, at 30,000 feet, dealing with an adult who was outright antagonizing him. "Stand up for yourself," echoed in his mind. A few rows back, the elegant woman rummaging through her handbag. Her name was Camille Montgomery, had witnessed enough of the exchanges to see something very wrong. She'd flown enough times to know that flight attendants usually maintain a veneer of politeness, even on their worst days. She leaned across the aisle to speak to Mr. Garrison. "Have you seen how she's treating that boy? It's disgraceful." Mr. Garrison nodded, shutting his laptop. "It's not right. He's just a kid. I'm thinking of saying something, but I don't want to cause a bigger scene." "Maybe we should." "Someone has to stand up for him," Camille insisted. In the row ahead, Charles and Mary Evans whispered similar concerns to one another. The entire first-class cabin, minus the boy's direct row-mate, who was fast asleep, seemed on edge over Sabrina's behavior. Nobody had spoken to the pilot or the head purser yet, but their discomfort was evident. About an hour later, Sabrina made another pass through first class with snacks. She offered salted nuts, cheese plates, or fruit cups to the passengers. When she reached Malcolm, she paused. "You want something?" she asked. Malcolm forced himself to speak steadily, though his pulse fluttered. "Yes, please. May I have the fruit cup?" Sabrina took a moment, and then her lips curled in a sneer. She placed the fruit cup on his tray table without handing him any utensils. Then she pivoted, turned away. Before leaving, she murmured under her breath, acting all high and mighty, loud enough for Malcolm to hear, but quiet enough to maintain an air of deniability. That did it. Malcolm's heart pounded with indignation. He gathered his courage and spoke up, still respectful but firm. "Excuse me, Ms. Hayes. Is there a reason you're being so rude to me?" Sabrina turned around, clearly not expecting him to confront her. Her face hardened. "Don't speak to me like that. I'm just asking a question." "You've been nothing but—" "Enough," she barked, and the force of her tone drew the attention of the entire first-class cabin. "I don't want to hear another word from you. Do you understand?" Silence hung in the air. Malcolm shrank back, feeling both anger and a stab of hurt. Sabrina marched down the aisle, leaving behind stunned passengers who exchanged shocked glances. Moments later, Daniel approached Malcolm, leaning down to speak quietly. "Are you okay?" Malcolm nodded stiffly, but he couldn't hide the emotional weight pressing on him. "She's treating me like I've done something wrong." Daniel sighed, glancing toward the galley, where Sabrina was rummaging for something. "I'm so sorry. I've never seen her act like this. I'll have a word with her. Thank you." Malcolm managed, grateful for any sign of allyship. Daniel disappeared toward the front of the plane. Minutes later, raised voices could be heard from behind the curtain, separating the galley from the passenger cabin. Though the words weren't clear, the tension was palpable. Sabrina's voice was sharp, while Daniel's was more measured but definitely tense. One of the passengers, Mr. Garrison, stood up and walked toward the curtain. He caught Daniel emerging, looking flustered. "Let me speak to the captain," Mr. Garrison said. "She's out of control." Daniel hesitated. "We prefer to handle these things within the cabin crew first, but if you insist, I'll arrange for you to talk to the head purser or the captain." Mr. Garrison nodded. "She's harassing that boy, and it's not acceptable." At that moment, Sabrina poked her head out. "Is there a problem, Mr. Garrison?" He leveled her with a stern gaze. "Yes, there is. I'm concerned about how you're treating that young man, and I'm going to address it." Sabrina scoffed. "Maybe you should mind your business." Gasps erupted from the handful of first-class passengers who could hear. It was more than unprofessional. It was confrontational. Mr. Garrison turned back to Daniel. "Please get the head purser or the captain. Now." The head purser for Flight 627, a woman named Anita Morales, was notified of the situation. She came up to the first-class cabin to talk with Sabrina, Daniel, and the complaining passengers. By then, the entire section was on edge. Malcolm sat quietly in his seat, feeling a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and a desire to vanish. Anita spoke calmly. "I understand there have been some issues." She looked from Sabrina to Mr. Garrison to the others who seemed upset. "Sabrina has been harassing that kid," Mr. Garrison said bluntly. "We've all witnessed it." Anita turned to Sabrina, who immediately went on the defensive. "I was just enforcing the rules. He was being disruptive." At that, Charles Evans spoke up. "He did nothing disruptive. You spoke rudely to him from the start." "We all saw it," Mary Evans chimed in. "This is unacceptable. That poor boy is traveling alone, and you're making his flight a nightmare." Sabrina's face flushed red, and she folded her arms defensively. Anita, sensing an escalated conflict, asked Sabrina to step aside so she could speak to the passengers directly. One by one, those who had witnessed the behavior expressed their shock at Sabrina's actions. Finally, Anita turned to Malcolm. "Could you please tell me, in your own words, what happened?" Malcolm swallowed hard, feeling all eyes on him. "It started when I boarded. She questioned if I was in the right cabin. Then she kept giving me dirty looks. She rolled her eyes at me when I asked for ginger ale. She dropped my meal in front of me, then scolded me when I accidentally dropped a water bottle. She's been hostile." Anita nodded, her expression apologetic. "Thank you. I'm very sorry for your experience. We'll resolve this. Please don't worry." She went into the galley with Sabrina, presumably to chastise her. For a moment, Malcolm felt some relief. Maybe this would be sorted out, and the rest of the flight could continue peacefully. Little did he know Sabrina's bitterness ran deeper than a simple reprimand. Inside the galley, Sabrina fumed. He's just a kid who thinks he's better than everyone. Look at him with that fancy suit, probably thinking he's rich or something. I don't see why everyone is ganging up on me. Anita kept her voice controlled. Even if that were the case, you're a flight attendant. Our job is to provide professional service. You crossed a line. Sabrina's eyes narrowed. I'm sick of people like that. They think they're entitled to special treatment. Anita sighed, rubbing her temples. You need to calm down. I can't have you disrespecting any passengers, let alone a child. We're going to finish this flight without any more incidents. Understood. Sabrina nodded sullenly, but did not apologize. Anita instructed her to maintain her distance from Malcolm. Let Daniel handle his needs. You focus on the other passengers. Is that clear? Sabrina nodded again. She felt humiliated, singled out, and furious at Malcolm for causing the confrontation, even though it was her own behavior that had caused the conflict. While the flight continued, tensions remained high. Sabrina avoided Malcolm, but her hostility simmered just beneath the surface. She resented him even more now that Anita had reprimanded her. Meanwhile, the other passengers tried to go about their business, but a sense of unease lingered in the cabin. Mr. Baul. Garrison opened his laptop again, but found it hard to concentrate. Charles and Mary Evans kept casting worried looks at Malcolm, who tried to lose himself in a book. At one point, Daniel quietly approached Malcolm's seat. Hey, kiddo. I just wanted to check in on you. Do you need anything? Malcolm mustered a small smile. I'm okay. Thank you. Daniel offered him a fresh bottle of water and a bag of cookies from economy class, then moved along. The simple kindness made Malcolm feel a little better, but in the back of his mind, he still felt the sting of Sabrina's words. Halfway through the flight, turbulence struck again, this time more severe than before. The plane bounced and shook, rattling overhead bins. The seatbelt sign flashed, and an announcement from the cockpit told passengers to remain seated. Daniel and Sabrina scrambled to secure the galley and return to their jump seats. Malcolm's heart pounded, as it always did during heavy turbulence. He gripped the armrest, trying to steady himself. Suddenly, a sharp jolt caused several items in the galley to topple. A tray of glasses shattered, sending shards skidding across the floor. Sabrina, securing the last cabinet, slipped on a piece of broken glass and lost her footing. She let out a startled cry, falling onto her side. Her arm banged against a metal cart, and she grimaced in pain. Daniel, strapped into his jump seat, could do nothing to help her immediately because the plane was still rocking. After a few more minutes of intense shaking, the turbulence eased enough that Daniel could unbuckle and help Sabrina to her feet. She clutched her arm, wincing. Daniel, concerned, asked, Are you okay? Sabrina nodded, but tears shimmered in her eyes more from rage and frustration than pain. She insisted she was fine. A part of her wanted to blame her mishap on the stress that Kid had caused. Twisted logic, yes, but her anger needed a target. As soon as the seatbelt sign was off again, Malcolm, curious about the crash he'd heard, stood and cautiously moved toward the galley. He saw Sabrina sitting on a jump seat, cradling her arm, with Daniel kneeling beside her. "Are you okay?" Malcolm asked softly, genuinely concerned despite everything. Sabrina looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes before a scowl replaced it. "I'm fine," she snapped. "Go back to your seat." Malcolm stood there a moment, torn between politeness and fear. Eventually he turned and walked away, but Daniel caught his eye and mouthed silently, "Thank you." The tension only thickened. Unable to shake the discomfort, Malcolm headed to the lavatory area to splash some water on his face. On his way back, he found Camille Montgomery standing near the aisle waiting for the lavatory. She offered him a kind smile. "Hey there," she said. "Tough flight, huh?" Malcolm nodded, relieved to see a friendly face. "Yeah," he managed. Camille hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry you're going through this. If you need anything, someone to talk to, I'm here." A wave of gratitude washed over Malcolm. "Thank you, Miss Camille," she introduced herself. "Thanks, Camille. I guess I'm just confused why she hates me so much." Malcolm blurted the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Camille's eyes softened. "Sometimes people judge us for reasons that have nothing to do with who we really are. Don't let her make you doubt yourself." Malcolm nodded. "My dad always says the same thing." Camille smiled. "He sounds like a wise man." Malcolm offered a shy grin. "He is. He's actually the CEO of this airline." Camille blinked, taken aback. "Delta. You're telling me your dad is Charles West?" Malcolm's cheeks reddened, suddenly, cautious. "Yes, ma'am." Camille's expression turned astonished, and then delighted. "Unbelievable. He's an incredible businessman. I've followed his career. He's making big changes at Delta. Wow." She paused, her gaze flickering with concern. "Does Sabrina know who you are?" He shook his head. "No. And I don't want to use that as a shield. I just want to be treated with respect." Camille nodded firmly. "I understand. But if this continues, you might have to speak up. You shouldn't endure this." Malcolm thanked her. As she moved toward the lavatory, he returned to his seat, mind racing with whether or not to reveal his identity. Would it help or just make things worse? With about 2 hours remaining in the flight, Sabrina's mood was in freefall. Her arm throbbed from the tumble, and her pride was deeply wounded. Passengers were whispering about her, and she felt humiliated. She paced in the galley, ignoring Daniel's attempts to get her to rest. Embers of anger flared in her chest every time she glanced toward Malcolm's seat. "That boy thinks he's so important," she thought bitterly. She had no idea just how close to the truth that was. Eventually, she decided she would not suffer silently. She was determined to put Malcolm in his place one last time. At a moment when Daniel was in the economy cabin assisting passengers, Sabrina marched toward Malcolm. Malcolm had been dozing lightly when Sabrina's presence startled him. She stood in the aisle, her arms crossed. Charles and Mary Evans watched from across the aisle, alarmed. "You and your fancy suit," Sabrina began in a low, tense voice. "Think you're so special?" Malcolm's stomach churned. He opened his mouth, but no words emerged. "I've had enough of your attitude," Sabrina hissed. "Coming on board like you own the place, making demands. You're just a child. Act like one." This time, Malcolm found his voice. He stood up, trembling, but resolute. "I haven't done anything to you. Why are you so angry with me?" "Oh, you've done plenty," she said, leaning closer. You think you can just snap your fingers and get your way. You think because you can afford a fancy ticket, you're better than everyone else. Malcolm's mind raced. He recalled his father's words about standing up for himself. The cabin around them seemed to freeze. Passengers in first class stopped reading, paused their movies, removed their headphones. All eyes were now on the confrontation. I don't think that Malcolm said, voice shaking. I'm just traveling home like everyone else. Why do you have to hate me for no reason? Sabrina scoffed. You want to talk about reasons? Fine. I've seen kids like you in first class before acting entitled. Parents shower them with money, giving them everything they want, never teaching them humility. Meanwhile, people like me have to work for a living. Her voice rose, and veins strained in her neck. The tension snapped. Mr. Garrison stood up. That's enough. Leave the boy alone. Mary Evans joined in. Yes. Step away from him. This is unprofessional. But Sabrina ignored them. You know what? If you were my kid, I'd teach you a lesson in respect. That final sentence burned in Malcolm's chest. Tears stung his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. You have no idea who I am, he said, his voice quivering with defiance. Or who my father is. Sabrina gave a short, mirthless laugh. Oh yeah, who's your father, the mayor or something? Malcolm drew a shaky breath. My father is Charles West, the CEO of Delta Airlines. This airline? Gasps rippled through the cabin. Several passengers exchanged stunned looks. Sabrina's mocking smile faltered for a split second before she recovered, rolling her eyes dramatically. Sure he is, she retorted. And I'm the Queen of England. But the rumble of murmurs in the cabin told Sabrina that the passengers believed Malcolm. After all, Charles West's face had been in the news for months, heralding his new leadership. Sabrina's confidence wavered. Mr. Garrison turned to Sabrina, shaking his head. He's telling the truth. Charles West's son is named Malcolm. I read an article about the new programs he's implementing for youth leadership. That must be him. Mary Evans nodded. Yes, and it makes sense. He's traveling alone in a suit in first class. I believe him. Sabrina's eyes darted between them, and panic spread across her features. She turned back to Malcolm. Is this some kind of trick? Malcolm stood straighter, swallowing back the lump in his throat. No. I didn't want to say anything. But you kept pushing me. In that moment, Daniel returned from economy class, having heard the commotion. He rushed down the aisle. What's going on, Sabrina? He saw her cornering Malcolm and passengers on the verge of revolt. He just claimed he's the CEO's son. Sabrina spat, pointing at Malcolm. Daniel looked at Malcolm, then back at Sabrina. The color drained from Daniel's face. He'd seen Charles West in corporate newsletters and training videos. There was no mistaking the resemblance. Oh, my God, Daniel breathed. Malcolm West. Malcolm nodded, relief and trepidation battling in his chest. That's me. At that confirmation, Sabrina's eyes widened. She stepped back as if she'd been slapped. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The cabin erupted in a wave of hushed chatter. Some passengers glared at Sabrina, while others whispered in awe about who Malcolm was. Mr. Garrison. Charles and Mary Evans. Camille Montgomery. Everyone who had witnessed Sabrina's behavior shook their heads in disgust. Daniel quickly took charge, guiding Sabrina back to the galley and out of the aisle. Anita Morales, the head purser, was summoned again. She arrived to find Sabrina in a state of shock, her eyes brimming with tears, though whether they were from regret, fear, or both was unclear. Anita's voice was calm but firm. "Sabrina, go to the crew rest area and remain there. Daniel and I will handle the rest of the service." But Sabrina began only to be cut off by Anita's leveled glare. "That's an order." Sabrina swallowed, glanced at Malcolm from across the cabin, and said nothing as she disappeared behind the curtains. Daniel offered an apologetic smile to Malcolm. "I'm so sorry. I'll make sure you're comfortable for the remainder of the flight." Malcolm let out a shaky sigh. "Thank you." Relief washed over him, though he still felt residual anger and sadness. Anita then apologized profusely to Malcolm on behalf of Delta Airlines, promising the airline would make this right. "I will be filing a full report. Rest assured we do not tolerate such behavior from our staff." Malcolm nodded quietly. He believed her, yet he couldn't shake the emotional weight of the incident. He knew his father would hear about this. In fact, the thought of telling him was equally daunting and relieving. Dad is going to be furious. And protective, Malcolm thought. As Flight 627 began its descent into JFK, Sabrina remained out of sight. Daniel completed the landing procedures in first class, making sure Malcolm and the other passengers had everything they needed. The mood in the cabin had shifted to one of tense anticipation. Everyone wondered what would happen once they landed. When the wheels touched down on the runway, a collective sense of relief swept through first class. Malcolm finally allowed himself to relax. He gazed out the window, watching the lights of New York flicker in the darkness, thinking about how he would convey this story to his father. Would his dad be calm and collected, or would he erupt with anger? The plane taxied to the gate, and as soon as the seatbelt sign clicked off, passengers stood up to retrieve their belongings. Before disembarking, Mr. Garrison and Camille paused to speak with Malcolm, offering words of support and encouragement. Charles and Mary Evans did the same, exchanging phone numbers with him in case he needed witnesses to the incident. Malcolm felt incredibly grateful. Their solidarity reminded him that not everyone would stand by silently in the face of injustice. When Malcolm stepped off the plane, he was met by an airport official holding a sign with his name. The official greeted him warmly. "Mr. West, your father's car and driver are waiting for you." Malcolm nodded, still reeling from the flight. As he walked through the jet bridge, he noticed Sabrina being led by Anita, presumably heading toward a meeting with higher-ups. Sabrina glanced at Malcolm, and he caught a glimpse of sheer dread in her eyes. He couldn't help but feel a pang of pity for her. Yes, she had treated him terribly, but he also recognized that her prejudice and bitterness stemmed from something deep inside her, an ugliness that would continue to poison her life unless she confronted it. Whether she would learn or not was out of his hands. In the arrivals area, Charles West stood waiting. Malcolm rushed into his father's arms. Charles embraced him tightly, relief evident on his face. "Welcome home, son," Charles said, smiling. Then he noticed Malcolm's subdued expression. "What happened? You look upset." Malcolm took a deep breath. "Dad, we need to talk about that flight." Charles's eyes narrowed with concern. "Did something happen?" Malcolm nodded, casting a quick glance around to ensure privacy. "Yes. It was bad. One of the flight attendants treated me horribly the entire time. She was racist, Dad." Charles's face hardened. He placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "Come on. We'll talk in the car." They made their way to a sleek black SUV waiting outside. Inside, Malcolm recounted the story in detail. His voice quivered at times, but he managed to relay each hurtful encounter. Charles listened intently, his jaw tightening, eyes darkening with each new reveal. By the end, he looked both angry and deeply saddened. "I'm so sorry you had to endure that," Charles said, pulling his son into another hug. "This is unacceptable, especially at the airline I run, where I've pushed for more inclusivity and stronger ethics training. I promise you, son, this will be addressed immediately." Malcolm nodded, feeling the wave of emotional exhaustion. He just wanted to go home, shower, and sleep in his own bed. But he knew this was far from over. The following day, Charles West wasted no time. He called an emergency meeting with the Vice President of Cabin Crew Operations and the Head of Human Resources. Anita's report, along with statements from multiple first-class passengers, painted a damning picture of Sabrina Hayes' behavior. Daniel's testimony only confirmed the severity. Sabrina was summoned to a disciplinary hearing. She arrived in a conservative suit, her arm still bruised from the flight. She sat opposite Charles West, who fixed her with a steely gaze. "Ms. Hayes," he began, voice calm but cold. "I understand there was an incident on Flight 627 involving my son Malcolm West and multiple other passengers who witnessed your misconduct." Sabrina shifted nervously. "Mr. West, I didn't know he was your son." Charles held up a hand, silencing her. "It doesn't matter if he was my son or any other passenger. Your behavior was unprofessional, discriminatory, and a clear violation of Delta's code of conduct." Her eyes flickered with desperation. "I was having a bad day. I let my emotions get the best of me." Charles's expression remained unreadable. A bad day does not excuse racist remarks, intimidation or harassment of a minor. This is not a minor infraction. It goes against everything this airline stands for, and everything I personally stand for. Sabrina gulped. Tears pooled in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. Please, I need this job. It won't happen again." He watched her for a moment, weighing the sincerity of her plea. Then in a firm tone he said, "You're suspended without pay, effective immediately. We will conduct a full review. If we confirm the allegations, which we already have substantial evidence for, you will be terminated. Furthermore, we will provide an opportunity for you to enter a sensitivity training program if you wish to ever be reconsidered for employment at Delta or any of its affiliated airlines." Sabrina looked as though she'd been slapped. She started to sob, but Charles wasn't moved. She had not only humiliated Malcolm, she had shaken the trust that passengers place in the airline. And as a father, Charles's anger was tempered only by his duty to address the matter through the proper channels. Security escorted Sabrina out of the building. The weight of her actions bore down on her, and only time would tell if she genuinely repented or merely grieved the loss of her job. Word spread quickly among the flight attendant community. Sabrina, once seen as a competent, if somewhat abrasive crew member, was now branded a liability. Many expressed outrage at her actions, citing her blatant racism. A few sympathized with her downfall, attributing it to one big mistake. But most recognized that bigotry had no place in a modern airline, especially one led by someone like Charles West, who championed diversity and respect. Meanwhile, Charles implemented additional training modules for flight attendants, focusing on implicit bias, emotional regulation, and professional conduct. He personally oversaw some of these sessions, sharing Malcolm's story, without naming Sabrina as a cautionary tale. The message was clear: such behavior would not be tolerated, no matter who the passenger was. In the days after the incident, Malcolm tried to move on. The memory of Sabrina's sneering remarks still stung, but the outpouring of support from the other passengers, Daniel, Anita, and even random strangers who heard about the story, gave him solace. He realized that for every person harboring prejudice, there were many more who believed in fairness and kindness. He also felt a sense of pride in his father's swift and just action. Charles West didn't give preferential treatment just because Malcolm was his son. He treated the situation the same way he would if it were any other passenger, albeit with the added personal resolve to ensure it never happened again. The airline launched an investigation concluded that Sabrina's actions violated both company policy and ethical standards, and officially terminated her employment. Weeks later, while walking through JFK with his father on the way to another youth summit, Malcolm caught sight of a woman cleaning tables in a coffee shop outside the secure area. He recognized Sabrina, looking tired and worn. She hadn't noticed him yet. He felt his stomach twist with conflicting emotions: pity, anger, sorrow. She lost her job, Charles murmured, noticing Malcolm's stare. Actions have consequences. Malcolm nodded. Part of him wanted to confront her to say something, but another part felt it was best to let it go. Just as they were about to pass by, Sabrina looked up and locked eyes with Malcolm. She froze, color draining from her face. This time, there was no hostility. Just shame. Malcolm offered a nod, barely perceptible, as though silently acknowledging the past. Then he followed his father onward, leaving Sabrina behind to grapple with her choices. As the weeks melted into months, the turbulence of that infamous flight gradually faded into the rear view of Malcolm's young life. But the experience had left its imprint like a scar that didn't hurt anymore, but remained as a reminder. He had gone back to school and resumed his regular activities: debate club meetings, his youth leadership circle, weekend volunteering at a local shelter. On the surface, life looked normal again. But something inside him had changed. The flight had tested his sense of identity, and what came out of that storm was someone stronger, more self-aware. Malcolm had learned that courage doesn't always come with loud defiance. Sometimes it's in simply holding your ground with quiet dignity. His classmates never guessed what he'd endured 30,000 feet in the air. But when he spoke in class presentations about standing up for justice or the importance of empathy, there was a new weight behind his words. At home, he and Charles shared more quiet conversations. They didn't always talk about the flight directly, but there were moments over dinner during car rides when his father would ask, "How are you really feeling about it?" Malcolm appreciated that. It was never rushed, never forced. Just two black men, one young, one seasoned, navigating a world where dignity was too often challenged by bias. Meanwhile, Delta Airlines underwent tangible changes. Charles had kept his word. He didn't just reprimand Sabrina. He used the moment to push for systemic improvements. All flight staff, new and old, underwent updated training in implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and conflict resolution. The company even introduced a mentorship program, pairing junior staff with senior leaders to build a culture of openness. Flight 627 had sparked not just punishment, but progress. Malcolm started receiving emails from passengers who had been on that flight. Some found him through his youth leadership program's website. Messages of support came from Mr. Garrison Camille, the Evanses, and others who had witnessed the injustice firsthand. "You inspired us." One message read, "You reminded us why speaking up matters." Yet even with the wave of support, Malcolm occasionally wondered what had become of Sabrina. Did she learn anything? Did she regret what she'd done, or just the consequences? He might never know. But he realized something profound. Forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. It requires release. And he was ready to let go. The flight that began with judgment and humiliation ended up becoming one of Malcolm's most defining moments. Not because of what was done to him, but because of how he chose to respond. And in that quiet decision to carry himself with grace, he didn't just preserve his self-worth, he elevated it. The wound had healed, and in its place grew purpose. The auditorium was silent as Malcolm stepped onto the stage. Rows of students, educators, and business leaders sat attentively, eyes fixed on the young boy in a navy blue blazer, who now carried a quiet gravitas far beyond his 13 years. This was the closing keynote at the Youth Leadership Summit in Atlanta, a national gathering of tomorrow's leaders. Malcolm had been selected to speak not just for his academic merits, but for his grace under pressure during a now widely discussed incident in the skies. The room buzzed with anticipation. Everyone had heard something about the boy on Flight 627. Now they would hear it from him. He took a deep breath, stepped up to the microphone, and began not with anger, but with clarity. "I want to share a story," he said. "Not to embarrass anyone or to seek pity, but to show what can happen when one voice stands up and when many voices stand together." He recounted what had happened on the flight, the judgment, the mistreatment, the silence from some and the courage from others. He didn't name Sabrina. He didn't have to. The lesson was larger than one person. "There were moments I wanted to shrink, to disappear," Malcolm said. "But every time I felt small, someone reached out. A kind word, a supportive glance. That made all the difference." He paused, then let his words sink deeper. "See, prejudice doesn't always look like shouting or violence. Sometimes it's in a cold glance, an assumption, a question that wouldn't be asked to someone else. But compassion is powerful too, and when people speak up not for themselves but for someone else, that's what changes the world." The audience was spellbound. No movement, no coughing, just breathless attention. "My father told me once," Malcolm continued, "don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. And I learned something on that flight. You can't control how people treat you, but you can always control how you respond. With strength, with dignity, with purpose." He looked out at the crowd, his voice now stronger. "If you see someone being mistreated, don't look away. Be the voice. Be the anchor. Because silence helps the bully, but compassion saves the soul." A hush followed, then a single clap. Then another, and in seconds the auditorium erupted into a standing ovation that thundered through the hall. Backstage, Charles West stood watching, pride swelling in his chest. He had given countless speeches in boardrooms and conferences, but nothing compared to what he had just witnessed from his son. Malcolm had taken pain and turned it into purpose. Later that night, social media lit up with clips from the speech. Youth groups, advocacy pages, and education networks shared Malcolm's words. The young CEO's son, who stood for justice, became more than a story. It became a movement. And for Malcolm, it was only the beginning. He knew his journey forward would be shaped not just by his name or his father's title, but by how he chose to wield his voice, not as a victim, not as a celebrity, but as a vessel for change, a greater purpose indeed. Thank you for staying until the end of this powerful story about courage, empathy, and consequences. If there's one key takeaway, it's that a single act of kindness can overshadow many moments of cruelty, and that when we stand up for what's right, karma has a way of balancing the scales. In Malcolm's case, he not only found the courage to speak up, but also discovered the collective strength of supportive bystanders. For Sabrina, harsh lessons were learned, proving that prejudices can destroy careers and reputations in an instant. If this story touched your heart, please remember to share, and subscribe to our channel. Your engagement helps us create more meaningful content and spread messages of positivity and awareness. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. Together, let's continue to share uplifting tales and make kindness go viral. Thank you for watching.